7-2.
7-2.
7-2.
Okay, thank you, Madam Secretary. We literally have a plane to catch here, so I'll introduce Vice Chairman Winters and begin the testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I have the privilege, actually, of asking for Senator Tom Coburn. 6 years he was in the House, 10 years in the Senate, and he now is working with the Convention of States project. He had, as you've already said, he has a plane to catch, and so I'd just like to ask him to be able to speak at this time.
Please come ahead,
Thank you,
Senator.
Mr. Chairman. It's a pleasure for me to be able to address you, and I would just give you my personal thanks for what you do. Most of the time, you really don't get real attaboys for the time you give up and the scoldings that you take, so I would just say thank you for doing that. I'm coming before you not as a Democrat or a Republican. I ran for office every time as an American citizen because I was worried about our future. And when I took the oath of office, I meant it. And so when I looked at the Constitution, I didn't look at the annotated Constitution. I looked at what our founders intended. And the reason I ran for office every time is because we're off track in our country. And although I have great hopes for the future, I have no belief that the future will bring us more liberty, less government, and less headaches in terms of our children. Our children now face $1,680,000 apiece in unfunded liabilities that include the debt. Their net asset value right now of millennial generations is minus $7,000 per average. So the question comes is, what does our oath ask us to do? And you all swear to the same oath that I did as a U.S. Senator in the U.S. Congress, and that's to defend the Constitution. The Constitution gives us the answer to our problems. I believe it was an inspired document. I think it's been prostituted by both careerists, by federal judges who meant well but didn't see the long-term ramifications of violating the very core principles that was in it. And the answer to that is an Article 5 amendments offered convention, approved and offered by 34 states. I have no misgivings about putting the full weight of the rest of my life behind this, because I saw human action in the centers of power in this country. And I know what the result is when we conflict desire for a future in politics versus the desire for the best interest of our country. And I saw it time and time again. So I've dedicated the rest of my life, whatever that might be, to working to solve the problem from the outside, because I'm assured through my own experience and my own gray hair that we're not going to solve it on the inside. So my call is for you all, the very people the founders trusted the most, the state legislatures, the state bodies, to actually come and rescue our country and restore us back to a balance of power between the three branches and a balance of power between the states and the federal government, as it was intended, not as what we have today. So I thank you for the time. I don't have the time to stand and take questions, but I have a very able boss who's here as well, who can answer those questions, and I thank you.
Senator, thanks very much for testifying today. We're on House Joint Resolution 1, and Vice Chairman Winters, if you want to step back and get us going again here.
Yes, sir.
Please begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it's an honor to actually be sitting down here and presenting a bill to you all. And we have debated the particulars of a particular provision within the Constitution several times over the last couple of weeks. But let me just speak to you regarding this bill, and I'm sure you've had the opportunity to look at the particular language here. This bill has several whereas clauses, which are common, but as you read the whereas clauses, I do believe that many would agree with the premise of these clauses. And so rather than highlight each, let me move on to what is the crux of the bill on page 2. Page 2, section 1, starting at from lines 15 to 23. This is the uniform language that is the language that needs to be submitted from all of the states in its entirety without changes. And that language, let me just read it for you. The legislature of the state of Wyoming hereby applies to Congress under the provisions of Article 5 of the Constitution of the United States for the calling of the Convention of the States limited to, and there are three things it's limited to, proposing the amendments to the Constitution of the United States that, one, impose fiscal restraints on the federal government, two, limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, and three, limit the terms of office for its officials and for members of Congress. Now, I have an amendment that we will read in at a later time that will allow for something on page number 5 to limit our delegate to that convention for proposing amendments regarding one of those aspects. But in section 2, this is language that was more recently recommended just to help people understand. The legislature of the state of Wyoming adopts this application expressly subject to the following reservations, understandings, and declarations. And I believe that this is a key statement because this entire bill, this entire resolution hinges upon these reservations, understandings, and declarations. And I believe that one could argue that these reservation, understandings, and declarations already exist in an understanding of Article 5, but we're making it even more clear in regards to this bill. That an application to the Congress of the United States to call a convention of the states pursuant to Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution to propose amendments to the Constitution confer, and here's key language, no power to Congress other than the power to call the convention. Now move down to Romanet 2. Congress shall perform its ministerial duty of calling an amendment convention of the states only upon the receipt of applications for an amendment convention for the substantially same purpose as this application from 2/3 of the legislatures of the several states. That is something that is already understood, but we're making it clearer still. Number 3 continues on. Congress does not have the power or authority to determine any rules for the governing of an amendment convention of the states called pursuant to Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution. Congress does not have the power to set the number of delegates to be sent by any state to a convention, nor does it have the power to name delegates to a convention. The power to name delegates remains exclusively within the authority of the legislatures of the several states. It's stating something that is already true, something that already exists, but we're making it abundantly clear here. Romanet 4, by definition, a convention of the states to propose amendments to the Constitution means the states shall vote on the basis of key, one state, one vote. 5, a convention of the states to propose amendments to the Constitution convened pursuant to this application shall be limited to consideration of the topics specified herein and no other. If you go down to line 22, this application shall be void ab initio if ever used in any manner to propose or consider any change to any provision of the Bill of Rights. And so we're making something that is already true clearer still. And so, Mr. Chair, what we're doing as we move on, and I could just go through and read line after line, I'm not going to do that. But let me just tell you where the amendment will come in just a moment. That will add Romanet 8. And that amendment will read, the legislature of the state of Wyoming further instructs its delegates not to support term limits for members of Congress that would limit service in any office to less than 18 years. And I'll explain that at the appropriate time. I just wanted to read that in. Then section 3 is necessary language talking about this being a continuing application in accordance with Article 5. And then section 4 instructs the Secretary of State as to where to transmit copies of this resolution to the President of the U.S., the President of the Senate, the Speaker of the House, and the United States Congress, and to the Wyoming Congressional Delegation. With that, Mr. Chairman, these 6 pages are essentially the totality of the convention for proposing constitutional amendment. And with that, I would stand for any questions.
Questions for Vice Chairman Winters? Mr. Vice Chairman, it mentions the 2/3 threshold. How far along is the convention in achieving the 2/3 number of states it needs?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, currently this particular resolution has 8 states that have fully signed on to it. and is appearing before, and there are some people in the audience that can answer this even better than I can, but is standing before a number of legislatures this year. And so it's moving on. I think it's only been going for around 3 years, and so it's moving rather rapidly at this point.
Representative Canal.
Mr. Chairman, Vice Chair Winters, quick question on the, we've had several of these bills come through the committee in the past year. What's that going to do to affect this bill, or what does this do to affect those other bills?
Yes, thank you. Mr. Chairman, this bill actually dovetails nicely with it because the language here, you're referring to the balance of budget amendment and some of the other proposals, House Bill 50, which is a delegate limitation act. That, by the way, the delegate limitation act was necessary to put into state statute the rules and responsibilities that a delegate from the state of Wyoming will have to the state of Wyoming. This right here dovetails nicely with that. As you'll see in point number 1, it actually puts some sideboards on the previous statement as well. Because point number 1 on line 20 is the understanding that the delegates would impose fiscal restraint. And that is important because in balancing the budget, if one chooses to balance the budget by raising taxes, that is something I think that would not bring a lot of concurrence amongst members of our state delegation. And so this right here actually brings further sideboards to some of those things as well. But also what I like about this one in section 1 is all 3 of these kind of dovetail. Imposing fiscal restraint, but really it's difficult to impose fiscal restraint unless one is willing to limit the power and jurisdiction of federal government. And that is, I believe, the crux of this particular uniform language. And then thirdly, limiting the terms. You'll notice that it's not just for members of Congress, but this also speaks toward the federal judiciary and so on. So there's all of that kind of ties together and actually makes the message of our state something that carries tremendous weight.
Thank you.
Representative Pelkey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Vice Chairman, you're actually calling for a limitation on judicial appointments in terms of the time that they
Vice Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, in this right here, you'll notice limiting the terms of office for its officials and for members of Congress. So this is speaking toward the federal, anyone within the federal government, either an official or members of Congress. And so how that shapes out, this doesn't say how long those terms ought to be or whether terms of service or length of service would even pass that convention. But of course, that's a policy decision, but it does allow for that within this uniform language.
Representative Pelkey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Vice Chair, I see page 2 or page 4, line 11, by definition, a convention of the states proposed amendments shall vote on the basis of one state, one vote. Where is that definition other than in here? Because it's not in Article 5.
Mr. Chairman, I would gladly answer that one. I'll also say that some of the best minds on this particular issue are actually standing in the room. And so for me to answer that would be a little bit like a Little League player standing there while Hank Aaron's up next. And so, Mr. Chairman, either at this point I could invite them or we could save that question for later, but it would be your discretion.
Okay. I'd say just park that one on the sideline for now and
Yes.
see if you have anything else to say. Are there any other questions from the committee? Okay, seeing none, we'll move to the next witness who'd like to speak to the bill.
Hank Aaron, please stand.
Big 44. That's how we'll know them.
Mr. Chairman, honorable members of the committee, my name is Mark Meckler. For the record, it's M-E-C-K-L-E-R. I'm the president of the Convention of States Project. So it's a little overwhelming being referred to as Hank Aaron and also Senator Tom Coburn's boss. So all of those shoes. I appreciate the honor of being before the committee today, and I would like to simplify the question before you today. I've traveled around the country. I've been in 40 state legislatures talking about this issue over the last couple of years. issue comes down to a very simple question facing states all across the country and the citizens of these fine states. And that question is simply two words: who decides? This is the fundamental question of American governance today. The question is not what should we do. We hear debates about Obamacare, particular tax levels, or which agency should regulate what. All of those debates in Washington, D.C. presuppose that those decisions should be made by smart people in ivory towers very far away from Cheyenne, Wyoming. The real question, again, facing America is who decides, and the way that I would answer this question, the way that the Convention of States Project answers this question as I stand before you in this committee today, is that in Wyoming, you should decide for the citizens of Wyoming. That's true for all 50 states. That was the balance of the power as the founders intended. It is why they set out very limited, specific, enumerated powers in the United States Constitution. And unfortunately, as Senator Coburn put it, that Constitution has essentially been prostituted by the federal government at every level and in every branch for most of the last 115 years. And today we have a balance of power that says Washington, D.C. decides. Specifically in your state, you face issues, serious issues with the EPA controlling your land. You've got the Clean Water Act of the United States facing you. And we may get some temporary relief from those pressures under the current administration. But it's important that we put the emphasis on the right word in that sentence, which is temporary relief. Politics swings in Washington, D.C. We've seen it over and over. I think Representative Winters has spoken previously about the number of times Republicans have held both houses of Congress and the presidency. I think there are 4 times in recent history. So it doesn't happen very often, which means we're going to see a swing back the other way. No matter what improvement we get out of Washington, D.C. this year or over the next few years, that improvement will swing back the other direction eventually. The founders were wise enough to give us a mechanism that allows us to adjust the balance of power should it ever get out of kilter. This is how this happened is actually really important. September 15, 1787, Colonel George Mason of Virginia stood. He addressed the men assembled in the Constitutional Convention. You'll note that date's just 2 days before the end of the convention. And he said to the men assembled, "We've made a terrible mistake with the document we've written in that we've given the power to Congress to propose amendments should they deem them necessary. But we haven't given that same power to the people acting through their states." And he asked them a very important question. He said, "Are we so naive that we suppose that a federal government which becomes a tyranny will propose the appropriate amendments to restrain its own tyranny?" I wish we had video because I'm sure they laughed. No tyranny in all of human history has ever proposed anything to restrain its own tyranny. And so Mason's proposal to add the second clause of Article 5, giving you the power to restrain federal tyranny, was adopted by that assembly. The debate did not take place. It was actually unanimous, and Madison's notes unusually reflect that there was no debate. The men there thought that this was so profoundly wise, they realized it's just something they had missed. They put it in, and they unanimously adopted to give you the power. I think this is incredibly important. They had faith in you, that you would be the bulwark against federal overreach, that you would stand as the wall, the last wall for liberty. And they did have that faith, and if you read the Federalist Papers, they say that they believe that you would jealously guard your powers against the encroachment of the federal government. And you have a chance to do just that today. As the EPA reaches into your industry, your ranching industry, into your mining industry, into the farming industry, as the Department of Education tells you how to spend your education money, as the federal government itself controls roughly 60 to 65% of your budget. It is time for you to stand in the way that the founders asked you to, and the way the founders knew you would, and to vote for this resolution to call a convention of states to restrain federal tyranny. Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Questions for Mr. Meckler? Representative Pelt.
Why don't we start with the question that I asked earlier, Hank?
Sure. To restate the question was, Representative Winters, Mr. Chairman, indicated that it's one state, one vote. You guys have that in your resolution. And you are correct, it does not say that in the Constitution itself. And so that question comes up quite often. First of all, why doesn't it say it in the Constitution? And the reason it doesn't say it, and the reason you don't see much specificity about how a convention looks, is because the vast majority of the founders who were at that convention had been at many previous conventions. They knew the process. It's as if you guys were passing something about how a legislature would run. Most of you know the process and how it runs. So there would be a lot of